Why, hello and welcome back to The Watchbox. This is Watchbox Studios. I'm your host, Tim Mosso, and this is Watches Tonight. This evening, we explore the most exciting rivalry of 2021, Rolex versus Grand Seiko. We conduct a live Q&A with our global audience, and of course, I am sharing viewer wrist shots from around the world. Joining us in the box, Blue Shirt Buddha, Alex Asha, we've got Thomas Burnett, we've got Richard Combs from South Florida, lots of friends joining in fast and furious. And remember to check out the redesigned thewatchbox.com to see who pays for these pixels. I'm all about Bethune, so I always open up with that page when I show you on this show. But we have many brands, everything from Patek Philippe to a la Silberstein and all in between. Pre-owned and vintage. 3,000 watches live right now. Keep me streaming. Open a new window for thewatchbox.com. All right, remember to check out Tim_Mosso on Instagram. I have a couple of platforms these days. It can be tough to keep track, but I'm doing the Instagram thing and I'm doing 1-minute reviews. I now have over 1,200 of them posted. You can literally daisy chain my Instagram page for like an hour. It's incredible. Check out Tim_Mosso. Join me on Instagram, updating every day. And the best part is it's all for sale. So if you see something you like, back to thewatchbox.com and pick it up. All right, let's see. We got a lot of friends. We've got Marceau. We've got Get Outta, Andrew M. joining in from Edinburgh, Scotland. We've got Pascal L. joining in from Switzerland. We've got Matteo C. joining in. Alexi Simola of Finland. We've got Addie Myers of West Yorkshire, UK. Boss Defender joining in from Germany. Simon Holt. Jason P. Anyone nostalgic for the handwritten Tim Mosso sign? We're talking about the inventory shows I do on Wednesdays and Saturdays right there. We've got Yahia B. joining from Egypt. We've got Dave Opencar, a big fan of Zin. Galvin Wong, Marco B. from Firenze, or the home of Panerai. And we've got Butik 1 joining in from Poland. Pratham K. from Toronto. Pratham, you're in our wrist shots tonight. Mr. Enigma and Daniel F. joining in from Mexico City with Mark S. from Brooklyn. All right, viewer wrist shots. I asked, you answered. Let's see what we got tonight. Jay from LA starts us off hitting the open road with my all-time favorite Rolex Daytona in platinum and ice blue. That is a really good looking watch. So nice that I don't even mind that you didn't capture the car in there. Watches and wheels or just watches behind the wheel. That thing is aces. All right, now let's take a look at what Saad A from Saudi Arabia has. Shooting his Watchbox sourced Patek Philippe 5035P annual calendar by the palm in his yard. Very nice capture. We've got Anthony L. who is sharing nothing other than his Blancpain 50 Fathoms mil-spec Hodinkee edition with a different look than we normally see, as this one is on the full X71 bracelet rather than a NATO. I think it looks awesome. Very cool classical wrist shot. Well done. Amin S. and his GMT, along with, and this is a man after my own heart, another watches and wheels shot, his BMW M2 competition at Rolex Service USA in Dallas, Texas. John W. browses his wine options, and he has many, with the FP Journe Octa Divine that he bought from Watchbox. John, thank you for trusting our company. Saad, too, thank you for trusting our company. Guys, let's remember that Monday Mailbag at thewatchbox.com is where you send those pieces to see them on these pixels. So send me your wrist shots. Monday Mailbag at thewatchbox.com. Jumping into the box right here, we got J-Bo Surf joining in from Adelaide, Australia. Time Hill from Virginia. Mark S. saying, Episode 9 of the Tim Mosso podcast was awesome. That was where I went through all of my Grail watches in the past. If you haven't seen www.timmosso.com, you need to check it out. It's where you can read my article every week as well as my podcast. This week we've got a new podcast on my Grail watches. We've also got one coming that is the podcast version of my video interview with Max Busser of MB&F. All right, let's see. John N's in the box. Eric Nielsen from North Carolina. We've got Miroslav joining in, and we've got Purity of Essence and Ethan Davis from Orange County. We've got Nordic Monkey from Sweden, and we've got Philly Watch Fan, who sounds like a local. All right, John N. shouting out the Octa Divine. He's a fan. let's talk about the biggest potential rivalry of 2021. I find it the most interesting, not because it's a battle in earnest or a battle of equals, but step aside King Ghidorah and Godzilla, because Rolex versus Grand Seiko is the most exciting watch hobby storyline and the one I most want to see in the year 2021. First, let's explore how we got here to the point where we're even comparing these brands out of hand. Let's start with Rolex, and I think when you talk about Rolex, at least in the current sense, that is, in the present idiom, you have to go back to 2013 when the insanity started in nascent form. Now that was the year Rolex launched something all new, a black and blue bezel GMT. Not something they'd done before. Lots of nicknames, the black and blue, the Dark Knight, the Batman, but it was a phenomenon then and it became a mania over time. Fast forward to 2016, Baselworld. I was there. I saw this watch when it came out, and I thought, okay, well that's one way they can get another 2-3 years out of the current Daytona. I never imagined that literally half a decade later, that watch would be selling at 2.5 times its retail price as a used watch. Fast forward 2 more years to 2018. And we get a steel Pepsi for the first time in a generation, now available once more on the traditional Jubilee bracelet. Pre-owned markets go nuts, wait lists stretch to infinity, and then 2020. We have an all-new Submariner, and it's often said that if Rolex is the best-known name in watches, the Submariner is the best-known Rolex, which kind of makes it the master of them all. And that wasn't it, not by itself, which led to this insanity. Did you ever imagine you would see an Oyster Perpetual selling for over $17,000? Guys, that watch retails for $5,900. If that isn't crazy, I don't know what is. Yes, it's got that lovely Tiffany blue dial, but still, we're in the realm of crazy talk. You know, it's like Mugatu. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills. And indeed, maybe I am, because I don't see that watch being worth 300% of its retail price. I think we have better options, and we're going to explore that. But in spite of its volume, we're talking about Rolex shortages, even as the company makes 1 million watches a year, as though this is like the COVID vaccine and the shortage actually matters in the big picture. It doesn't. But if you're stressed about this, there is an alternative, and that alternative is Grand Seiko. Japan's best watch launched internationally in 2010. And that is to say, before then, they found their way around the world, but they were never expressly marketed in North America, in Europe, Latin America, Africa. This was a new proposition for Grand Seiko, actively seeking foreign markets, and perhaps its most recognizable modern watch debuted that very year, then known as the SBGA 011. Everyone, including its designers, called it the Snowflake, and we were off to the races. Now, the dial of that watch is the highlight, and it's instantly recognizable. It's one of the few watches in this industry you can see macro shot about an inch away from the dial and still identify the model and the reference. This is a watch defined by a dial, and it might be a dial that defines an entire watch brand. Was it a big deal? It was, and it remains so. But they continued. In 2012, we got the first oblique hints that Grand Seiko might be willing to chase Rolex just a little bit. That's a timepiece, and believe it or not, there was a silver dial version that is an anti-magnetic watch, the SBDX 093. There was even a CERN dial version, which was all silver and satin. And I don't think Grand Seiko has ever paralleled Rolex design language so closely. It's not something they do often, and not something we would see again. But I have to say, it was a shadow of the future, as in 2014, Grand Seiko, now an international brand, wins a GPHG nod in Geneva. And this was the Petite Aiguille, a price point award for the best watch in class. The Grand Seiko GMT SBGJ005, a limited edition, resplendent in green, gold, and steel, taking the cake in Petite Aiguille. A big status boost and a shot in the arm for Grand Seiko. 2017 arrives, and Grand Seiko decides to take itself a little bit more seriously. Gone is the standalone Seiko script from 12 o'clock on the dial. Now, the only place you see Seiko on that dial features the word Grand next to it. focusing on Grand Seiko more as a standalone luxury manufacturer rather than a branch of the more broadly priced and some might say pedestrian Seiko watch. Grand Seiko is now a true luxury product. Fast forward to 2018, 2K18, and we start to see what Grand Seiko does so well in this modern era, which is to take a historically inflected case, in this instance the 44GS from 1967, and pack it with technical and aesthetic virtuosity. The Kirazuri dial, or shiny painting, this is the SBGA 385 here. It was a watch designed to effectively combine spring drive, the technology of the future, with the 44GS case, the case of the past, and a dial that was entirely unique, the kind of thing that only Grand Seiko does. A few hundred pieces, a dial you'll never see again, and it was a special occasion, as this marked the arrival of Grand Seiko Corporation of America, a full-fledged standalone business designed to market Grand Seiko in North America. Another big step forward for the brand. And 2020 arrives. What did we learn? That Grand Seiko was taking notes. We complained about the size of the Spring Drive GMTs. So watches like these SBGEs, the Spring Drive GMTs of last year, were 40.5 millimeters, making for an easy comparison with, say, a 42 millimeter Rolex Explorer 2. But we also had technical upgrades, as it was a big year for Grand Seiko movements. We had an all-new spring drive, the 9R, now with twin mainspring barrels, now a 5-day power reserve, thinner than before, but also more accurate, 10 seconds a month rather than 15. Mechanical movements, and I mean pure mechanical movements, also got an upgrade with the arrival of a new 9S A5. Now, this high beat movement combines a full balance bridge and a free sprung index like a Rolex with a double impulse direct and indirect system that's a lot like the Omega coaxial, and it increased the power reserve. Despite being an El Primero style 10 beats per second, power reserve goes from 55 hours to 80 hours. Also important, it's a really good looking movement, and in the past that was not the case with the machine finished 9S from Grand Seiko. They were technically impressive, but they were visually mundane. Now we're starting to look pretty good, and we're getting blued screws as part of the bargain, which gives it a little bit of a high horology air about it. Grand Seiko is going places. So let's see what you guys are saying in the box right now. I can see we've got quite a few of you, and this chat box is flying, my friends. I'm sorry if I missed some of these comments. 121 click bezel SBGE 257 green. Yes, you guessed that would be my favorite of the trio, and indeed it is. Daniel Waxman saying, I just sold a Rolex Datejust for a Grand Seiko SBGA 413, the Seasons series. I like it. Pink dial, blazing Zaratsu polished case, technically outstanding, a great series from last year. Right here we've got Engineer Wannabe saying, whoa, I caught a live show. Good evening from Toronto. Engineer, welcome aboard. Somaranki saying, finally made it again. Greetings from Budapest. Well, thank you for joining me from continental Europe. I really appreciate you staying up late with us right here. Blake Starr saying, Grand Seiko is much better than Rolex, especially their mechanical and automatic movements. They need to work on their bracelets, and we're going to explore that towards the end of this show, because we're going to talk about strengths and we're going to talk about weaknesses. Abdul saying, I feel that Grand Seiko needs to release a smaller size, only brushed, non-polished watch, no date, and power reserve at the back. And then right here, Young Kim saying, all roads lead back to Rolex. So a counterpoint opinion right there. Marco saying, way too many limited editions from Grand Seiko that simply change dial colors but keep the same patterns. That decreases how special a watch is. Limited edition is therefore useless. And then right here, we've got John N saying, the bracelet is what bothers me most of all on Grand Seikos, and I'm not going to disagree with that. We're going to talk a bit more in depth about that. We've got Andreas A. joining in from Cyprus, staying up late with us in the Mediterranean, and Steve joining from the Great White North in Canada, saying, I love the Grand Seiko GMTs except the bracelet. Do I sense a recurring theme here? I do. Let's see. Talking about yours on mine, fewer wrist shots. Your wrist on my list. Let's go with Jorge N. of North Carolina and his Watchbox bought B Swiss Day Date. Giving a shout out to Phil of the Watchbox sales team. Phil will be happy to hear that. Thank you for trusting our company too. Pratham K of Toronto. He's in the chat box right now and he's at the wheel of his Land Rover with his Seiko Presage SRPB 043, the cocktail. Ben H. and his Rolex Oyster Perpetual 41. Lucky man, you got in early. Are on vacation in Wilmington, North Carolina, and you can see the mighty BB-55, the USS North Carolina, lead ship of a battleship class of 2 in the background. It is today a museum. You can check it out. Highly recommended. Wilmington, as well as the battleship North Carolina. Thank you so much for the good memories, Ben. We've got Mikhail B. of Poland and his Omega Speedmaster 57 as he prepares for his first solo flight of 2021. Fly safely, Mikhail, and Watch Sal greets our audience with his Rolex Submariner from Atlantis on the Palm in Dubai. That is without a doubt our most exotic wrist shot of the night and a very cool depth of field effect. Guys, send your wrist shots to mondaymailbag@thewatchbox.com. We've got D. Stifle saying, only issue with GS bracelets are that some of them have pin and collar link attachments. The bigger issue is the pressed metal clasp on the divers. It's true. The clasp has a lot of useful features in it, but it feels as though it were wrought from tinfoil. And in that sense, it's about 2 generations behind the current Rolex clasp. We're going to talk about that. Abdul right here saying, I wear my Datejust on the Jubilee, but the Explorer 2 on the Rubber B. Better than any bracelet day to day for me. Eric S. greetings from Watch Fam. And then we've got John N. agreeing that shot from the Atlantis on the Palm was an awesome one. I really liked that, guys. I want you to shoot the watches on your wrist, but if you can, shoot the shots so they seem spectacular. Fire, travel, food, cars, but also dogs and cats. If you don't have a Ferrari, I'd love a shot of your pug. Does not matter. Monday mailbag at thewatchbox.com. Galvin Wong, recognizing the incredibly refined Grand Seiko 9F quartz watches, saying that they occupy an important niche that oyster quartz, had Rolex continued it after 2001, could have occupied today. And indeed, that ultra chronometer grade, super premium quartz is something that is not widely sold outside the realms of Omega X33s and Breitling Super Quartz. It's just not something you see often. And frankly, Rolex should have stayed in that market, but we're fortunate to have the 9F. Now, let's talk a little bit about why Rolex versus Grand Seiko framing makes sense. You might protest that there's no comparison between one brand that makes 1 million watches a year and a second brand on the other side of the world that makes 45,000 watches a year. But the companies are far more similar and more comparable than the bare numbers suggest. The face value is in fact deceptive. Consider this, 9.5 billion versus 5.5 billion. Company A is Seiko Epson, a global industrial empire that is over 80% larger by revenue than Rolex Geneva and Rolex BN put together. Now, Seiko Watch is smaller, but Seiko Epson is not, and the greater Seiko group is even larger still. Now, they are both vertically integrated manufacturers, and I don't mean they make movements. Yes, they make movements. There are some companies like Moser that make movements. That doesn't mean they also make cases and dials and crystals and shock protection springs and lubricants. Rolex and Seiko, and Grand Seiko by extension, both do that. When you get a Grand Seiko watch or a Rolex watch, you know that bracelet, case, clasp, dial, hands, shock protection springs, even the lubricants that are used within were developed and are made in-house. And that's a level of integration that not even Patek Philippe and Audemars Piguet have achieved. I would also remind you that each of these companies has 2 basic core brands. You've got Tudor and you've got Rolex. You've got the entry level and then you've got the parent brand. You have Seiko, which is immense, and then you have Grand Seiko. Yes, there is also Credo, principally in the Japanese domestic market where there are many models, but for the most part, internationally, you have Seiko and you have Grand Seiko. The Credors that make it out of the micro artist studio and circulate around the world every year, they number a few dozen. They don't make that many Grand Sonneries and minute repeaters. So you have 2 very large groups that each have only 2 primary brands. Now, Grand Seiko 2021 novelties are under embargo right now. I can't tell you anything about them, but dealers are getting looks and the buzz is good, and I don't think I'm spoiling anything by saying that. It's going to be a big year for Grand Seiko. We're on the cusp, too, of receiving new Grand Seiko models as Rolex supply frustrations are coming to a head. 2021 Rolex models, anyone? I think most people would be happy to take delivery of their 2019 and 2020 orders in 2021. For a lot of folks, a 2021 Rolex means the Rolex they ordered 2 years ago, and that's not a great position to be in. Great for the company to have options and a wait list, but for the customer, it can be a little bit frustrating. So Grand Seiko has potential to gain momentum from here on out. And here's why. Omega, the traditional rival to Rolex, refreshed its Seamasters, its primary diver 300 meter, back in 2018 with some follow-on models like the ceramic and the chronograph models in 2019 and 2020. There's not much expected this year, as the Speedmasters were also revised last year and in 2019 when we got a slew of Apollo 11 50th anniversary models. Last year we got a new Snoopy and a new Moonwatch. There's not going to be a whole lot of fundamental sea changes at Omega this year, so it's about as competitive as it's going to be for 2021 at this point already early in March. Breitling. There's no doubt the brand has improved. The products are better, the size is better, they're selling better, people are talking about them, there's some buzz, the historically derived pieces have been well received. We are far from the lows, and I mean the historic lows that the company faced from 2015 to 2017, but it still feels more like a Tudor rival rather than a true Rolex rival in terms of size, style, collector esteem, and pricing standpoints. So Breitling versus Tudor, that's a decent narrative this year, but I don't see Breitling challenging Rolex for a whole host of reasons. So, meanwhile, Grand Seiko, we know, is moving upmarket with big boy pricing. That SLGH 003 with the new 9S caliber, that's almost $10,000, which is a lot of money. But that actually seems reasonable for what you get, like this high-beat powered beast. Again, a bigger picture of the movement from before, and you can better see just how attractive it is. Technically advanced, seriously upgraded, and gorgeous to look at. You don't feel bad paying 10 grand for that kind of product. And Grand Seiko seems to have at least one hit on its hands every single year. Look back to 2018 with the US market Kirizuri series. Those were immediately exported as people sold them to Europe and Japan because the demand for this piece, as good looking as it was global. Check out 2019 with the Skyflake, the SBGA 407, a delightful take on the hit dial, but in a very different color, case, style, the heritage case derived from the 1960 3180. It completely repackaged the snowflake look with a little bit more historic soul and elegance. And you know something? The watch was a sensation. Collectors agreed. They immediately sell when we have them. And that brings us to 2020's GMT, which we all agreed was a very cool piece, and now finally a Grand Seiko GMT that's like, smaller than this and wearable. Plus, we got the lovely Seasons collection, which has already received a shout out in our chat box tonight. You can see that 413 mentioned earlier, second from the left. Very good looking watches, characteristic of what Grand Seiko does best, which is to capture the local color of Japan and translate it into a form that is unique but also universally appealing, whether you're in North or South America, Africa, elsewhere in East Asia or Europe. These are just dynamite designs. Now, what other brand in mainstream luxury watches reliably has at least one monster hit each year? The only name that comes to mind, unless we're counting another Royal Oak variation from AP, but the only name that comes to mind is Rolex, the brand that has a hit every single year. Grand Seiko, welcome to the club. Viewer wrist shots number 3. I asked, you answered. Your analog on my digital, starting with Blaine T and his rose gold Longa 1 on a rose road trip with the Genesis G70. I love these watches and wheel shots, guys. Keep them coming. Simon H and his Rolex Sea Dweller. are in San Francisco for a night on the town. Good to see you getting out in these tough times. Rye and a Jaeger LeCoultre Master Calendar, a watch that I used to own and still love, shine in the sun for our viewers with a lovely overlapping cuff shot. That is a classic wrist shot. Well done, Rye. Bobby G of London is out for a drive with his VC Overseas Auto Blue Dial and Steel and his Porsche Macan GTS. Out in London, battling, I guess, the London fog and the cabs. Abdul R. of Germany explores the countryside of the fatherland with his Seiko 5 Eastern Arabic numeral dial. A very cool watch in a very cool place. Guys, send your wrist shots to mondaymailbag@thewatchbox.com. Okay, here we go. So many comments and so many contributions. I wish I could acknowledge them all. Let's start with Thomas Burnett. Tim, will you be joining Clubhouse? Your watch chat would be the go-to room. Guys, I've been asked about Clubhouse. Right now I'm on Instagram. I have timmosso.com. I have 2 YouTube channels. I have the Tim Mosso Facebook group, and we still have a studio audience in here with a good friend. So even in person, we have a lot of day-to-day interaction at the company. I don't want to say I'm stretched too thin, but I think one more platform might be the breaking point. Let me see what I can do about Clubhouse. This is not the first time I've been asked. I would love to be able to answer in the affirmative that we're going to do this and make it happen. I think what we're planning in the short term, obviously, is talking time with Tim Mosso on Facebook, where we're always engaged. And then hopefully later in 2021, 2022, we start doing in-person collector events around this country, and then also in Asia, in Europe. We're going to try to make this happen. Guys, stick with us. Keep demanding it. It'll eventually happen. Right here, we've got Love Watches USA, better late than never. What a Monday. New York strikes back. Tudor versus Grand Seiko is more appropriate. I think Grand Seiko price points and technical sophistication have gotten to a point where you have to compare to Rolex. There aren't many $10,000 Tudors, nor are there many Tudors with spring drive movements, 5-day power reserves, or, let's not forget, hand finishing from the micro artist studio. So if I'm going to make that comparison in terms of product substance, I'm going to make it to Rolex, not to Tudor. I think there are some top-end Seikos that now cost $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 that you definitely could compare to Rolex. Or Tudor. I'm not going to elevate Seiko that high. I'm going to say Seiko in that $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 price point is probably a better comparison to Tudor than Grand Seikos that cost, close to 5 figures or there at this point. Let's see what else is being said right here. We had another comment to the effect that the 9F quartz is the bee's knees. I gotta say, I'm really glad to see the 9F shoutouts here. There's such a prejudice against luxury quartz. I'm really glad to see a chat box where this is held in esteem. Let's see what else is going right here. We've got Jiri K saying, the most interesting thing about Grand Seiko for me is the movement built around magnets or whatever. I think you mean the spring drive? And then we've got Barra saying, Tim, take a deep breath and a break. Oxygen saturation under that mask should be low. We need you. Yeah, guys, inoculations are not far off. Believe me, no one's more excited about getting rid of the masks than we are. Sean, ain't that right? It's a fact. Keep the faith. All right here, we got friends like Marco saying, nobody compares to Rolex at retail. It isn't close, I'm sorry. Hey, it's not a battle unless there are two sides. And I'm happy to see that we've got folks cheering for both, because I didn't want this chat box to just be a Grand Seiko benefit. And then we have a question from Dave. Will Grand Seiko need less service than Rolex? Probably not. I remember seeing a Rolex tech document from 2015 that predicted 10-year service intervals alongside the 5-year warranty, saying 10-year service intervals were reasonable. And this was a document that Rolex actually published under its own name on its own website. Now, it's been taken down in the interim, but I can tell you I've never seen Grand Seiko representatives or folks from the brand in Japan claiming a 10-year service interval, nor have I seen Grand Seiko offer a 5-year warranty to match what Rolex offers. So I'm going to say it's probably true that unless you're dealing with a 9F quartz caliber, you're probably going to have to service a Grand Seiko a little bit more frequently than you would a Rolex. Oh, right here we got Kevin S. saying, my SBGV 245 quartz is a great daily driver. Sexy case too, and a very sexy dial. I love that watch. And then right here we have Enrique C. saying, SBGV 245 with the 9F movement is awesome. And then right here, what's going on? James Reason joining in the box, good to see him, saying, you can pour a pound of sand in a Rolex movement and it will still run. I doubt Grand Seiko is that robust. I don't know, but I would bet you Seiko is that robust. I wouldn't bet on them running accurately, but then again, basic Seiko automatic movements don't run accurately to begin with. But can you bust them up bad and still tick? I think you can. I think Seiko would accept that challenge. And then right here, Bud to Stud saying, Grand Seiko is a good watch. It's better than Seiko, but not as grand as my piano. So perhaps we're taking issue with the grandness of the brand. It's funny because years ago, I did a bunch of videos for Grand Seiko, and I pronounced it Grand Seiko. And I quickly got feedback to the effect that it has to be pronounced for the US market, Grand Seiko. Like, okay, you know, they're from Japan, but they're really from New York. I get it. I'm from New York too. What else do we have going on in here? We have Luis Molina. Do you see Rolex releasing another 36mm Explorer anytime soon? It's possible. We got a whole slate of new Oyster Perpetuals last year. We got a bigger Submariner. Is it possible that we see a redesigned Explorer that goes back to 36mm and maybe Rolex decides it's got enough 39 to 41mm sports watches? It's possible, but I don't see a downsizing that big happening. I don't think it's likely. Anything's possible, but I don't think it's likely. We've got Adrian C. is joining in from Australia saying, I love your work. My daily is the Batman Jubilee. Ultimate comfort. Okay, now let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Grand Seiko relative to Rolex. That is, what it's got going for it and what it needs to improve. You've already broached some of this in the chat box, so credit where credit is due. You guys are on point. So let's start with Grand Seiko's advantages because there are many. First, dial quality. Not just the fact that all the parts of the dial are hand finished, which they are emphatically not at Rolex. It's the balance, the beauty, the faceting that twinkles like a cut gem, the satination alongside black polish on a part the size of a flea's back, their fired blue steel seconds hands, the lovely textures and colors they achieve, the process, sometimes up to 12 individual steps to create these distinctive dials, all of which simply exude brand character and personality. It's very special. Flip the script, flip the watch, display casebacks. Better than ever after the 2020 upgrades, and curiously, Rolex, for all of its investments and movements over the last 20 years, does not give us a display caseback. That went away after 2014 with the death of the last Cellini prince. Advantage Grand Seiko. Spring Drive. It took from 1977 to 1999 to bring mechanical, manual wound, quartz regulated spring drive to market. Add a winding rotor and it didn't show up automatic until 2005. Despite an attempt by, of all things, Piaget to emulate this back in 2016, no one has successfully cloned the spring drive technology. And yes, at plus or minus 10 seconds a month with the latest 9R, it is far more accurate than even the most superlative of chronometers. Let's talk about the Micro Artist Studio. Hand-finished movements and display casebacks? Yes, please. There may only be a few dozen of these every year, but the fact that you're getting Philippe Dufour levels of finish in a Grand Seiko branded product means this is a sixth gear that Rolex does not have. Unless the long-rumored purchase of Patek Philippe somehow happens, and I'm not holding my breath, this is not a product Rolex will ever be able to counter. Now, let's talk about high horology. The corollary to the Micro Artist Studio is that it's not just finishing, it's also engineering. Do we want a constant force twin mainspring barrel tourbillon? Do you have to ask? Last year, Grand Seiko proved this is in the cards and it's going to happen. Rolex, no answer to this. Historic homages. That is the 2013 44 GS Tribute. Grand Seiko recognizes what it's done well in the past. Rolex will launch homage and tribute watches in its Tudor brand, but not its Rolex brand. While I am not necessarily a fan of re-editions and tribute pieces, a lot of folks like them quite a bit. And from Grand Seiko, they tend to be very faithful to the original historical fabric, which is to say this is a house specialty Grand Seiko has that Rolex cannot match. Now, price. While creeping up, it remains reasonable. 3-day power reserve, swimmable water resistance, ceramic bezel, dual time, power reserve indicator, all of that, all in-house for $6,200. I think that's still a deal. And by the way, I love that 257. Green dial, green bezel, sign me up. The price is still a selling point and an advantage, especially if you compare this to the $3,000+ premium you would pay to get an Explorer 2 over this 40.5mm SBGE. They are now true equivalents with the advantage in Grand Seiko's court. Now, audacity. You think Rolex would make a Godzilla watch, even if Godzilla were Swiss? Rolex is not going to make anything like this. You're not going to see a Rolex watch devoted to something enormous and loud from Switzerland, like Crocus, for example. It's just not going to happen. This is something Grand Seiko is willing to do because they are audacious and they take risks. A full snowflake dial, that's one thing, but a snowflake dial made of platinum, along with a case, hand engraved to match, that SBGZ001 from 2 years ago is a handmade watch inside and out. $75,000, hand-finished front, back, top, and sides. Rolex is not going to challenge that kind of artistic virtuosity. What Rolex does is consistency and quality, not necessarily the highest of high highs in high horology. That, right there, that's a Journe and Patek killer, not a Rolex killer. But it's nice to know that the same folks who build your Spring Drive GMT are designing things like this. Variety and availability. For now, availability is something that can change. Well, it can turn on a dime. It can change in a moment without notice. But for now, for all of its popularity and growth, you can still order Grand Seiko watches at the dealer and take delivery within, well, let's say the lifetime of a small pet. There are some guinea pigs that will be born, live, and die in the period it takes you to order a Rolex Daytona and take delivery. At the very least, with your Grand Seiko, Mr. Piggums is going to get to see the watch. So, let's talk about what Grand Seiko can improve, because there are things that need to change, and some of them have been broached already in the box. Let me jump in and read some of your comments real quick, because you guys always have the right idea. Dave T. opining that the Godzilla is a good watch, but the Godzilla stamp on the case back is a disaster. The Godzilla 65th anniversary watch, the SBGA 405, it had a stamp with the image of Godzilla and the anniversary logo on the reverse side, so you couldn't see the movement. So it was a little bit self-defeating when you have a display case back, but you cover it. Right here we see Barris saying that, is Rolex really challenging with any brand? I don't think so, and really they don't need as well. I think he's saying that Rolex doesn't need Grand Seiko's business, so it's not a fight. And I agree with you there, but I think an underdog rivalry is inherently intriguing, whether it makes a difference to the overdog or not. Then right here we've got Dr. J 1337 saying, none of these Grand Seiko watches actually look good to me though. And that's purely subjective. Though I will say this, with so many special editions, cases, dials, and yearly redesigns, you're more likely to find a design you like in the huge extended catalog of Grand Seiko than you are in the relatively static world of Rolex, where the watches are largely consistent from year to year, but you may have to go back to find the watch you like. Right here we have Sutat saying they're almost always blocking the exhibition case back with a sticker or a silk screen. And that's true. On a lot of Grand Seiko special editions, there is a graphic on the back that often covers the movement. And I think that's a mistake. That's one of many things they could do differently if they want to improve. And then right here, we have Brick Lane saying, Tim, you need an Azimuth Mr. Roboto. That's kind of a fun idea. You want to send me one? And right here we have Jean-Claude Beaver, he of the toothy grin. And we've got Thomas Burnett and Aaron saying, Seiko aesthetics are Swiss. There's absolutely nothing Japanese looking about them. I gotta disagree. A lot of the watches are exceptionally eccentric and regionally inflected. I would never look at the Godzilla or the Onbashira Tree Festival limited editions and say, yeah, that couldn't have come from any place but Switzerland. I really do feel like Grand Seiko, especially the extended Seiko family, like the Fugaku Tourbillon, which is a Crador, to be sure, but it's literally Great Wave off of Kanazawa, a traditional Japanese painting. So I don't think that's fair to pin a Swiss aesthetic on Grand Seiko. There may be many ways they can improve, and we're going to talk about them, but I don't think being less Swiss is something they need to do. And then right here, we've got James Reason saying, your Grand Seiko versus Rolex might be valid with the entry-level models, but there is nothing in the Grand Seiko lineup that goes up against Rolex's precious metal models. Did you just see the $75,000 Spring Drive? Because I think that really is. That's a platinum watch that's hand-engraved, case and dial, and it has like a Dufour level finished movement on the back. Anything Grand Seiko that comes out of the micro artist studio absolutely is a challenge to the higher level Rolex watches. And there's movement finishing at a level that Rolex will never match by choice. Now, what could Grand Seiko improve? A lot. First, design permanence. Just as I told you, Grand Seiko has a million different designs spread over decades. The bottom line is that that level of shuffle in the catalog undermines the value of any one design. Because if you look at the best franchises, if you will, in the watch world, Royal Oak, Nautilus, Submariner, Moonwatch, Reverso, consistency builds brand equity, whereas blowing it all up and redesigning every 2 to 3 years, that's like what Zenith and Breitling do, which is why it always seems like those brands are in a rebuilding mode. So I think design permanence, Grand Seiko needs to settle on a few things that should be the same from year to year. Every single model doesn't need to be blown up every year. And I think the best example of where they're doing that well is with the Snowflake, which is largely unchanged since 2010. And lo and behold, possibly their best known and most desirable model over that period. So there's something to be said about design permanence, Grand Seiko. Have a few core models that don't change, and then have all the other experimental stuff. Now, better bracelets. It's been mentioned in the chat box, and I agree with you. Years ago, I was at a dinner, and I was arguing that Grand Seiko fundamentally offered Rolex quality for what was then like 65% of the price. And a guy blindsided me with a comment about the bracelets and how bad they were. And even as I was explaining the quality of their case finishing and their dials and their movement technology, I had to acknowledge that in what was then the year 2017, a bracelet of titanium held together with pins and sleeves, it felt like an Omega bracelet from the 1990s or a tag bracelet today. It just doesn't belong on a watch that costs more than $5,000. In terms of the clasps, the Spring Drive divers, especially the SLGA 001 that came out last year with the new Spring Drive movement, awesome watch. But when you open up a dive clasp today and it feels like it was stamped out almost from like a piece of Christmas tinsel, it's just unworthy of a watch that's otherwise a class-leading superior product. Yes, the clasp has a lot of great functions built in, but it feels cheap. And this is all about subjectivity and aesthetics, the sense of a mechanism in the hand and how it sounds when you click it shut. This is very much the world of luxury, and Grand Seikos are now priced sufficiently that the clasps need to feel like what you get from Omega and Rolex. Big changes have to be made to the bracelets. Even the steel bracelet, while much better and held together by screws, not pin sleeves, it still feels ropier with more lateral play than what you get in an Omega or, lo and behold, Rolex, the industry standard. And this is a comparison with Rolex. What else could they do? Mostly smaller cases. They're getting better at this. Last year's GMTs were excellent. They have a lot of 40 to 41 millimeter watches. But this was the SBGC 229. This was the Grand Seiko Nissan GTR Special Edition. And I really liked it. I didn't like 46.4 millimeters. Just too big, even in titanium, sapphire, and ceramic. That's not going to work on my wrist. And I'm practically the target customer for watches and wheels hybrid like that looks that good. Honestly, 41 millimeters, I probably would have bought it. And I'm not even a Skyline GTR type guy. What else? Longer warranty. Guys, Rolex is 5 years, Grand Seiko is 3. Grand Seiko needs to be 5. In a world where Rolex is 5 and Omega is 5, and Breitling is doing 5 on its in-house calibers, every brand is gradually extending out to 5. Grand Seiko, there's no question that their warranty charges wouldn't go up. Their watches can be warrantied for 5 years. They are that good. They are a superior product. The watchmaking is impeccable. The lubricants are of their own development. I have total confidence in a 5-year warranty on Grand Seiko. Grand Seiko needs to follow up and show that it believes the watches are as good as they really are, because people will take note. And finally, advocates. It's great to talk about the 9F caliber in a chat box among friends, but we need to go out to the forums where people are talking about watches, and when someone says, should I wait 2 years for a Submariner, or should I wait 2 years for a Datejust 41 or an Oyster Perpetual 41, that's the time to bring up the 9F, to fight the good fight, not just for luxury quartz, but for the Grand Seiko brand itself. And ultimately, guys, this isn't about one brand beating another, as even if every single one of this year's 45,000 Grand Seiko watches steals a sale from Rolex, it wouldn't make a dent in Rolex's market share, profitability, image, or relative volume. It's more of a heroic moral victory against impossible odds. And that actually sounds like the basic plot outline for every manga, action anime, and Japanese samurai folklore tale I've ever heard. So it's probably a good point on which to end the show. Guys, let's take a look at viewer wrist shots. We're not quite done yet. Number 1 of viewer wrist shots, number 4, it's Matt C. of the United Kingdom, winning today's Pure Photography honors, bringing his Rolex Hulk to life. I love it. Toady S. submits a striking Omega Seamaster his and hers double wrist shot. Well done. Peter B. has discovered an extreme rarity in his Zenith Dayfly Classic multi-city world time diver. That's the first one I've ever seen in the wild. Very nicely done. Jason from Bristol, UK, the home of the SS Great Britain, shoots his Time Factors Smith's Navigator, a modern Mark 11 tribute piece. Very nice. Nathan B. shoots his Zinn 1800S Damazener, Tegament and Damascus steel, which he found on thewatchbox.com, and you will too. Great stuff on thewatchbox.com. Chris M. takes us home with his Blancpain 50 Fathoms and man's second best friend. Send your wrist shots to Monday Mailbag at thewatchbox.com to see your pieces on these pixels. Guys, thanks to everyone who joined in the box tonight. We had a rockin' discussion. Also, check me out after the fact on timmosso.com. It's literally my name, timmosso.com, where you can read my latest articles and listen to my latest podcasts. Guys, thank you so much. Thanks to my studio audience. Adam, you're the man. Sean, operating the switcher tonight. Always aces. Time out, Tim out. Thanks for logging on.